She got a job as a janitor at her father's company, but no one knew who she really was. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The headquarters of Carter Tech loomed over the city like a monument to progress. The glass and steel facade reflected the golden hues of the late afternoon sun, an emblem of power and innovation. From its humble beginnings in a small garage, the company had evolved into a technological giant, dominating the industry with groundbreaking advancements. It was the brainchild of Walter Carter, a man whose determination had carved out a place for himself in a world that had rarely made room for men like him. Walter Carter had never been handed success. He had fought for it with every breath. His journey from a struggling entrepreneur to a billionaire CEO had been fraught with obstacles, but he had emerged victorious. Carter Tech was his legacy, a symbol of perseverance and ingenuity. But as the years passed and his empire grew, so did the distance between the company's ideals and its reality. Reports of internal corruption, employee mistreatment, and a toxic work culture had begun to surface, whispered rumors that Walter could no longer ignore. The burden of leadership weighed heavily on his shoulders, and he knew his time at the helm was nearing its end. A recent heart attack had served as a stark reminder of his mortality, forcing him to confront a difficult truth. He would soon have to pass the company on to someone else. And there was only one person who could inherit his legacy: his daughter, Amalia. She had been groomed for this role from the moment she was old enough to understand the intricacies of business. With a degree from Harvard Business School and a sharp mind that rivaled her father's, she was more than qualified. Yet, despite her credentials, Walter hesitated. There was a difference between understanding business on paper and experiencing it firsthand. Amalia had spent years working in high-level positions, but she had never seen the company from the ground up. She had never walked the factory floors, never felt the weight of a system that crushed those at the bottom. When he had brought up his concerns, she had bristled at the suggestion that she was unprepared. "I've worked harder than anyone, sacrificed more than most," she had said, her voice steady with conviction. "I know what it takes to lead." Walter had leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Do you?" he had asked. "Or do you only know what it looks like from up here?" That was when he had proposed the idea, a radical, unconventional test. If she wanted to prove she was ready, she would have to see the company through the eyes of its most overlooked employees. For 2 weeks, she would become one of them. No privileges, no name recognition, just another worker among the thousands employed by Carter Tech. At first, she had laughed, assuming he was joking. But when she realized he was serious, her amusement faded into disbelief. "You want me to pretend to be an employee?" "I want you to understand what it means to work for Carter Tech," he had replied. "Not as a Carter, not as an executive, as an employee who is invisible to the people in power." Amalia had resisted at first. It was ridiculous, unnecessary. But as the days passed and she mulled over his words, a realization settled in her mind. This was her chance. If she could do this, she wouldn't just prove herself to her father. She would prove it to everyone who had ever doubted her. The decision was made. She had spent the following week preparing. A new identity was crafted for her: Amelia Emmy Johnson, an outsourced janitorial worker hired through a third-party cleaning service. Her official records were altered, removing any trace of her true background. She traded her designer suits for plain blue uniforms, her carefully styled curls hidden beneath a practical headscarf. Her perfectly manicured nails were trimmed short, and the expensive watch she had worn since college was left behind. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw Amalia Carter, heiress to a billion-dollar empire. She saw someone else entirely. The night before her first shift, she couldn't sleep. Doubts gnawed at her, whispering that this was a mistake, that she was walking into something she didn't fully understand. But beneath the uncertainty, there was something else, a determination she hadn't felt in a long time. This was more than a test. This was a chance to see the truth. At dawn, she left her penthouse, stepping into a world that had always been beneath her. For the first time in her life, she was nobody. The Carter Tech headquarters was a fortress of glass and steel, a place Amalia had known all her life. She had walked these halls as a child, sitting in on meetings beside her father, watching the executives move like monarchs through their kingdom. But today, as she entered through the employee entrance at the rear of the building, she was no longer a Carter. She was Amelia Johnson, a nameless worker in an ocean of faces that no one would notice. The difference was immediate. No one greeted her. No one acknowledged her presence. Employees brushed past without a second glance, too preoccupied with their own importance to notice the woman in the cleaning uniform. The security guard at the entrance barely looked at her as he waved her through. It was a stark contrast to the deferential nods and greetings she had grown used to in her real life. Her first stop was the janitorial office, a cramped space tucked away in a forgotten corner of the lower floors. A man in his 50s, with graying hair and an expression of exhaustion carved into his features, handed her a set of keys and a laminated schedule. He barely glanced at her as he spoke. "You're new. Just follow the schedule. You get 2 10-minute breaks and a 30-minute lunch. Bathrooms get priority. Don't steal. Don't be late." His voice was flat, mechanical, a man who had repeated the same instructions to countless others who had come and gone. Amalia nodded and took the keys. "Your locker's in the back. Keep your stuff in there. Anything goes missing, it's on you," he added before turning his attention to a clipboard, dismissing her without another word. She glanced around at the other workers in the room. Some were pulling on gloves, others filling mop buckets. They spoke quietly amongst themselves, but no one acknowledged her. She was an outsider here, too, even among the invisible. She changed quickly, placing her belongings in the dented metal locker assigned to her. The uniform felt foreign, stiff against her skin. It smelled faintly of disinfectant, a reminder of what she was now, just another cleaner in the building her father had built. Her first shift began on the executive floors, an irony that wasn't lost on her. She had spent years in these hallways, walking in heels that clicked against polished marble, surrounded by men and women in tailored suits. Now, she pushed a cleaning cart along the same floors, head down, ignored by the very people she had once worked beside. She moved quickly, following the checklist she had been given. Empty trash bins, wipe down desks, clean the glass walls of the conference rooms. It was monotonous, physical work, and within an hour, she could already feel the strain in her arms and back. The executives moved around her like she didn't exist. Conversations flowed openly in her presence, financial discussions, strategic plans, even complaints about colleagues, because no one thought twice about speaking freely in front of a janitor. She listened, absorbing details that would have been guarded if they had known who she really was. At one point, a young man in a suit nearly walked into her cart. He scowled, annoyed that she had dared to be in his way, before continuing on without a word. No apology, no acknowledgement, just irritation at the minor inconvenience she had caused him. It was a small thing, but it stuck with her. Hours passed, and the physical labor became more exhausting than she had anticipated. The chemicals and the cleaning agents stung her hands, even through the gloves. Her lower back ached from bending over sinks and scrubbing floors. The smell of bleach clung to her skin, sharp and unpleasant. She found herself glancing at the time, counting down the minutes until her shift ended. She had once spent entire days in boardrooms, losing herself in financial reports and business strategies, but here the hours stretched endlessly. At her first break, she sat alone in the small windowless break room designated for janitorial staff. The air was thick with the scent of microwaved meals and cheap coffee. No one spoke to her. She watched as a group of workers sat at the opposite end of the room, laughing quietly among themselves. A part of her wanted to join them, to introduce herself, but she hesitated. She wasn't one of them. Not really. She finished her break in silence and returned to work. As the day wore on, she began to notice patterns. The way employees would walk past her without ever making eye contact. The way some would sigh in annoyance if she was in their path, as if her presence was an inconvenience. The way higher-level executives acted as though the cleaning staff didn't exist at all. She had expected to be overlooked, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. By the end of her shift, exhaustion clung to her like a weight. Her hands were sore, her feet ached, and every muscle in her body protested with each movement. She returned to the janitorial office to clock out. The man who had given her the keys earlier barely glanced at her as she handed them back. "Same schedule tomorrow," he said before turning away. No good job. No acknowledgement of her effort. She stepped out into the cool evening air, breathing deeply, trying to shake off the weight of the day. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't realized just how much it would change her. The second day began before dawn, and Amalia found herself already awake when her alarm buzzed. Every muscle in her body ached from the previous shift, a dull, throbbing soreness that reminded her of how unaccustomed she was to physical labor. She rolled her shoulders, feeling the strain in her back, the stiffness in her hands from hours of scrubbing and lifting. The novelty of the experience was already beginning to wear thin, yet, as she stood in front of the small mirror in her temporary apartment, tying her headscarf tightly over her curls, she reminded herself why she was here. This wasn't about comfort. This was about seeing the truth. The city was still shrouded in darkness when she arrived at Carter Tech. The same security guard was at the entrance, his expression blank as he barely spared her a glance. It was a strange feeling, this invisibility. She had always been someone people noticed, a presence in the room, a voice that commanded attention. Now she was nothing more than a shadow passing through the halls. The janitorial office was just as lifeless as the day before. A few workers were already gathered, silently preparing for their shifts. No one greeted her, but she noticed the brief glances they exchanged. She was still an outsider among them. She picked up her assigned tasks for the day. Executive floors again. The thought of spending another shift cleaning up after people who wouldn't even acknowledge her existence made her stomach turn, but she pushed it aside. This was what she had signed up for. By the time she reached the 42nd floor, the office was already alive with movement. Employees hurried between meetings, voices filled the air with discussions about revenue projections and investor calls. Amalia kept her head down as she pushed her cart along the corridor, her hands already reaching for the cloth and disinfectant spray. She had just begun wiping down a glass surface when a voice cut through the air behind her. "You missed a spot." She turned, startled, to find a woman watching her with sharp, assessing eyes. Amalia recognized her immediately. Cynthia Brooks, Vice President of Finance. She had seen her dozens of times in meetings, had even spoken with her before, though she doubted Brooks had any recollection of that now. Cynthia crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "The glass, there's still a streak." Amalia glanced at the panel she had just wiped. It was spotless. Still, she forced herself to nod. "Yes, ma'am. I'll fix it." She turned back, running the cloth over the same surface again. Cynthia watched her for a moment longer, then, with slow deliberation, reached into her pocket and pulled out a tissue. Without breaking eye contact, she let it fall to the ground. "While you're at it," she said, before turning on her heel and walking away. Amalia stared at the crumpled tissue for a moment. Something about the gesture, the casual, deliberate act of forcing someone else to bend at her feet, sent a cold anger curling through her chest. But she said nothing. She bent down, picked up the tissue, and tossed it into her cart. The morning continued with much of the same. She worked through the executive offices, wiping down surfaces, emptying trash bins, scrubbing sinks that hardly needed cleaning. The exhaustion was beginning to settle deep into her bones, the motions becoming robotic. But no matter how efficiently she worked, there was always someone watching, always someone finding fault. And then there was Thomas Grayson. She had seen him the previous day barking orders at the janitorial staff, but she had avoided any direct interactions with him. Today, however, there was no avoiding him. He found her near the main conference room, pushing her cart towards the elevator. "You," he called. She turned, gripping the handle of her cart a little tighter. "Yes, sir." Grayson approached slowly, a tall, imposing figure in an impeccably tailored suit. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried the same cold detachment she had seen in so many other executives. He gestured toward the floor near her feet. "There's a streak." Amalia followed his gaze. The marble floor was gleaming. Still, she nodded. "I'll fix it." She pulled out a fresh cloth, crouching down to wipe the already clean floor. Grayson watched her for a few moments, then, without a word, reached for the coffee cup in his hand and tilted it slightly. A thin stream of dark liquid splashed onto the floor beside her. She froze. "Now you actually have something to clean," he said, stepping back. A few people nearby glanced in their direction, but no one said anything. No one intervened. It was as if this was perfectly normal. The heat rose in her face. Her fingers curled around the cloth in her hands, the impulse to throw it aside and stand up to reveal exactly who she was and put this man in his place burned within her. But she didn't. She swallowed down the anger, let it settle like a stone in her gut. Without a word, she wiped up the coffee. Grayson smirked, watching her work. "Make sure it doesn't leave a stain," he said before turning away. Amalia finished cleaning in silence. When she straightened, her hands were trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer force of holding herself back. She had known this experience would be difficult, but she hadn't been prepared for the humiliation. By the time her lunch break arrived, she had lost her appetite. She sat alone in the break room staring at the wall, trying to process everything. She had always known that power created distance. The people in positions of authority often saw those beneath them as nothing more than tools to be used. But experiencing it firsthand was different. It wasn't just about being ignored. It was about being diminished, dehumanized. She thought about her father, about how he had built this company from the ground up, How he had always prided himself on the values that Carter Tech stood for. Did he know this was happening? Did he understand how the people in his company were treated? Or had he been too far removed for too long? She had one more shift to get through before the day ended. When she returned to the executive floor, Grayson was waiting for her. She didn't flinch this time. He walked past her, then, as if on impulse, knocked into the edge of her cart. It tilted, toppling a stack of supplies onto the floor. "Clean that up," he said, not even stopping to look at her. Amalia inhaled slowly. Then, without a word, she knelt and began picking up the scattered items. She was no longer just observing. She was living in the reality of those who had no choice but to endure it. The third day blurred into the fourth, and by the fifth, the routine had become painfully familiar. Amalia woke before the sun, her body aching from hours of scrubbing, lifting, and bending. She arrived at Carter Tech through the back entrance, unseen and unnoticed, just another worker in the endless machinery of the company. She clocked in at the janitorial office, collected her supplies, and began another shift of cleaning floors that were never dirty enough to warrant the scrutiny they received. Every day followed the same rhythm, yet each was marked by small indignities that chipped away at her patience. Cynthia Brooks continued to drop things deliberately in front of her, her lips curling with satisfaction when Amalia bent to pick them up. Thomas Grayson found new ways to exercise his authority, always ensuring she was within earshot when he berated the janitorial staff for imperfections invisible to anyone but him. There was never a moment to breathe, never a chance to move unnoticed. She had been expecting the physical exhaustion. What she hadn't expected was the psychological toll. She had begun to recognize the unspoken hierarchy within Carter Tech, not the one on paper, but the one that truly dictated power. At the top were the executives, men and women in suits who navigated the building with effortless entitlement. Beneath them were the senior managers, people like Grayson, who wielded their authority like a weapon, ensuring that no one beneath them ever forgot their place. Then came the mid-level employees, those with just enough status to believe they were important, though not enough to be truly powerful. And at the very bottom, the workers like her, the invisible. It wasn't just about being ignored. It was about being disregarded entirely, as if her presence was nothing more than part of the background. Employees would walk past without acknowledging her, holding meetings as if she wasn't there, dropping trash without a second thought. The executives, in particular, treated her as though she was no more than an object that existed to serve their needs. Yet, some things were worse than indifference. She noticed that Grayson was singling her out more than the others. He never outright yelled at her. His cruelty was more refined than that. Instead, he found subtler ways to break her down. She would finish mopping a floor only for him to step across it with deliberate slowness, scuffing the polished surface just enough to demand she do it again. He would inspect a counter she had wiped clean and run his fingers along the edge, frowning as if disappointed. He rarely gave direct orders. Instead, he made comments designed to force her compliance. "Attention to detail is what separates the competent from the replaceable," he said one evening as she remopped an already spotless hallway. She had started keeping count of how many times she had redone the same tasks. 6 times she had been forced to clean the same section of carpet. 3 times she had wiped a table, only for Grayson to hover nearby and find some imaginary imperfection. Twice he had knocked over her cart, pretending it was an accident, making her scramble to collect the scattered supplies. She knew what he was doing. She had studied leadership and workplace dynamics long enough to recognize his methods. He wasn't testing her cleaning skills, he was testing how much she would tolerate. By the end of the week, she had learned the answer. She tolerated everything, not because she wanted to, but because she had to, because she was living the reality of thousands of employees who had no other choice, because she had to see how far this would go. One evening, as she emptied the last trash bin in an executive's office, she felt a presence behind her. "You think I don't see you?" The voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it that made her pulse quicken. She turned to find Grayson standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression that sent a warning through her body. She kept her face blank. "Sir?" He stepped closer. "You walk around here like you're above this job," he said, "like you think you're better than the others." She gripped the trash bag a little tighter, her heart pounding. "You've got the posture of someone who doesn't belong," he continued, tilting his head slightly as if studying her. "The way you move, the way you look people in the eye. You think I don't notice?" For the first time, she realized that her mask might be slipping. She had been so focused on enduring that she hadn't considered the possibility that she was standing out in ways she hadn't intended. She lowered her gaze slightly, adjusting her stance. "I'm just here to do my job, sir." Grayson smirked. "We'll see about that." He left without another word, but the weight of the moment lingered long after he was gone. She knew now that she had to be more careful. She also knew that whatever Grayson had planned next, it was only going to get worse. But Amalia had already made up her mind. She wasn't leaving until she had seen it all. Amalia had thought she understood power. She had grown up in its presence, seen how it shaped people, how it dictated the world around them. But what she had learned in boardrooms and case studies was nothing compared to what she was seeing now. Power wasn't just about wealth or influence, it was about control. The ability to make someone bend to your will, to remind them of their place, to wield authority like a weapon. Grayson had become more than just a difficult supervisor. He was watching her, scrutinizing her movements with an intensity that made her uneasy. He hadn't outright confronted her since their last conversation, but he no longer needed to. His presence alone was enough to unsettle her, to remind her that he was waiting for her to slip. And he wasn't the only one. She had begun to notice patterns in the way the executives operated, small details that might have gone unnoticed if she hadn't been looking. Conversations would stop when certain employees entered a room. Documents would be hurriedly tucked away. She heard whispers in the break room, employees lowering their voices when discussing certain names. And then there were the financials, numbers that didn't add up, discrepancies that she wouldn't have thought twice about before. But now, with everything else she had seen, stood out like flashing warning signs. It started with a simple observation. She had been assigned to clean the accounting department one evening when she noticed a conversation between two mid-level managers. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the hallway as if afraid of being overheard. "You're sure the numbers will match?" one asked. "They'll match," the other replied. "It's all being rerouted through the secondary accounts. By the time it gets reviewed, there won't be anything to trace." Amalia kept her head down, moving her mop in slow, methodical strokes, but her mind raced. Rerouted through secondary accounts. She knew financial manipulation when she heard it. That was the first crack in the surface. The more she listened, the more she noticed. Executives who should have had no reason to interact with one another meeting behind closed doors. discussions about adjustments in payroll, mentions of payments that didn't appear in any official records. Then there was Cynthia Brooks. Amalia had already seen how ruthless the VP of Finance could be, how she enjoyed exerting power over those she considered beneath her. But now she was beginning to suspect that cruelty wasn't her only vice. One night, while emptying the trash in Brooks's office, Amalia noticed an open file on her desk. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, but one detail caught her attention: several large transfers made to offshore accounts under names that didn't match any company records. She didn't have time to analyze it fully, but she saw enough to know something was wrong. Brooks was stealing, not just manipulating budgets or inflating expenses. This was something larger. Money was disappearing from funds meant for employees, bonuses, retirement contributions, even basic salary adjustments, and it was being funneled elsewhere. The full picture hadn't come together yet, but it was clear that there was more corruption within Carter Tech than anyone had realized. Amalia began keeping track, piecing together the puzzle. She started taking discrete photos with her phone, recording snippets of conversations when no one was looking. She saved copies of financial reports she found unattended, storing them in a hidden folder on her device. She had come here to observe. Now she was gathering evidence. And then she overheard something that changed everything. She had been cleaning outside a conference room when she heard her father's name. "It's only a matter of time before Carter steps down," a voice said. "Grayson. And when he does, then we make our move. Brooks already has the financials lined up. As soon as Carter's out, we shift the control structure. The board will side with us and his little heiress won't have a say in it." Amalia's breath caught in her throat. They were planning something bigger than just embezzlement. They were planning to take the company. She forced herself to keep moving, her hands gripping the mop handle so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wanted to burst into the room, to confront them, to reveal who she was and bring everything crashing down. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. If she exposed herself now, they would find a way to cover their tracks. She needed more proof. Undeniable, irrefutable evidence that would ensure they couldn't escape. For the first time since she had started this experiment, she felt real fear. This wasn't just about toxic workplace culture or abusive supervisors. This was a conspiracy, a calculated, deliberate attempt to seize power, to dismantle everything her father had built. And she was right in the middle of it. The game had changed. Now it was war. Amalia sat alone in her cramped apartment, the glow of her phone screen illuminating the small space as she scrolled through the files she had gathered over the past several days. Numbers, dates, names, pieces of a puzzle that had begun to take shape in a way that made her stomach tighten. What had started as a mission to understand the inner workings of Carter Tech had become something far more dangerous. She wasn't just a silent observer anymore. She had uncovered something that could shake the very foundation of the company. Her father's health had already made the future of the company uncertain. Now, with what she had overheard from Grayson and Brooks, she realized that they weren't just waiting for Walter Carter to step down. They were preparing to take over. The financial manipulation, the offshore accounts, the quiet power plays happening behind closed doors, it all led to the same conclusion. They were positioning themselves to ensure that when the moment came, they would have complete control, cutting her out entirely. She thought back to all the years she had spent preparing to take her place in the company, the endless hours studying business strategy, financial models, leadership dynamics. Yet none of it had prepared her for this. None of it had shown her the true nature of power, how it was wielded in the shadows by those who knew how to manipulate the system in their favor. She had assumed that merit and intelligence were the tools necessary to succeed. But here, in the heart of the empire her father had built, she was learning the truth. Power belonged to those willing to take it. The weight of her realization pressed down on her as she scrolled through the photos she had taken. The offshore accounts tied to non-existent contractors. The manipulated payrolls with names that didn't correspond to real employees. The quiet transfers siphoning funds away from the company's operational budgets. And then there was the deeper issue. The culture that had allowed this to happen. The way Grayson and Brooks operated wasn't just about greed, it was about control. They didn't see the employees as people. They saw them as tools, as disposable assets that could be used and discarded as needed. That was why Grayson found so much pleasure in belittling the janitorial staff. That was why Brooks didn't hesitate to funnel money away from the lowest-paid workers to pad her own financial security. Because to them, there was no consequence. Amalia had spent the last week experiencing that firsthand. The humiliation, the disregard, the absolute certainty that no one cared about the people who worked in the shadows of the company. It wasn't just about the corruption anymore. It was about the system that had allowed it to thrive. She wasn't just going to expose them. She was going to dismantle everything they had built. The next morning, she arrived at Carter Tech with a new sense of purpose. The exhaustion that had weighed her down the past few days was still there, but now it was fueled by something sharper, something colder. She had a plan, but it wasn't enough to have evidence. She needed to make sure that when she struck, they wouldn't have a way out. She started small, testing the waters. She lingered a little longer near conversations she wasn't meant to hear. She asked casual, seemingly harmless questions to employees who worked in finance and payroll. She took note of who hesitated before answering, who glanced over their shoulders before speaking. The fear was there, buried beneath professionalism, but she could see it. The people in the lower ranks knew something was wrong. They just didn't think they could do anything about it. That was what needed to change. But she had to be careful. She knew Grayson was watching her. He had become more deliberate in his scrutiny, his tests growing more pointed. He would leave fingerprints on surfaces he had seen her clean, waiting for her to notice. He would give her impossible tasks with unrealistic time frames just to see if she would complain. And when she didn't, when she met his gaze without breaking, he would smile that knowing, taunting smile. One night, as she finished wiping down the main lobby, she felt a presence behind her. "You're persistent," Grayson said. She straightened, but didn't turn to face him immediately. She didn't want him to see the anger simmering beneath her expression. "I try to do my job well, sir." He chuckled, stepping closer. "That's not what I mean." She finally turned to him, forcing herself to keep her expression neutral. "I watch people," he continued, studying her. "Most don't last. The ones that do learn to keep their heads down." She said nothing. "You, though," he tilted his head slightly. "You don't look down enough." The weight of his words hung in the air. It wasn't just an observation. It was a warning. She met his gaze, refusing to blink. "I just focus on my work, sir." Grayson smirked, but said nothing more. He turned and walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. She exhaled slowly. He knew something was off about her. He didn't know what, not yet, but he could sense it. She had to act soon. The next day, she reached out to the only person she could trust, her father. It wasn't easy. Walter Carter had been a formidable presence in the corporate world for decades, a man who had built his empire from the ground up. He wasn't someone who could be easily shaken. But, as she sat across from him in his home office that evening, presenting the evidence she had gathered, she saw something in his expression shift. He listened in silence as she explained everything: how she had uncovered the financial fraud, how Grayson and Brooks were orchestrating a quiet coup to seize control of Carter Tech, how they were using their positions to exploit the people who worked beneath them. She showed him the documents, the recordings, the evidence that made it impossible to deny. When she finished, the room was silent. Walter leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His hands were folded in front of him, his fingers pressed together as he processed everything. Finally, he looked at her. "You realize what this means?" She nodded. "It means we take them down." A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I always knew you were ready," he said. "I just didn't know you'd prove it like this." She felt the weight of his words settle over her. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. This was about justice. And now, she had everything she needed to see it through. The morning of the board meeting arrived cloaked in an air of unease. Amalia woke before dawn, the familiar weight of exhaustion pressing against her limbs, though this time it wasn't from the physical labor of scrubbing floors or hauling trash bags. It was something deeper, heavier. The knowledge that by the end of the day, everything would change. The truth she had uncovered would no longer be a secret. She dressed with care, not in the stiff, bleach-scented uniform she had grown accustomed to over the past 2 weeks, but in the tailored navy blue suit that had long been a part of her executive wardrobe. It felt foreign after so many days in disguise, as if she were slipping into the skin of someone she had once known but no longer recognized. The drive to Carter Tech was eerily silent. She had spent so many years entering this building as the heir to an empire, walking through the front doors with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged. But today she entered differently. Today, she walked through the same back entrance she had used for the past 2 weeks, weaving through the corridors that smelled of industrial cleaner, past the janitorial office where no one would think to question her presence. The uniform was gone, but the weight of the experience remained. She had seen too much to ever look at this place the same way again. The meeting was set to begin in less than an hour. The boardroom was already filling with executives, their voices low, their expressions unreadable. Amalia knew the routine. She had sat at that table before, had watched the way power shifted in the room, the silent calculations being made with every exchanged glance. But today, she wasn't just an observer. She moved to the far side of the room, positioning herself near the windows, unnoticed among the gathering crowd. Walter Carter entered last, his presence commanding as always. The conversations hushed as he took his seat at the head of the table. His gaze flicked toward her for the briefest moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Thomas Grayson was seated to his right, exuding the same polished confidence he always did, though there was something in his posture, a slight tension in his jaw, that told her he was still watching her. Cynthia Brooks sat across from him, her manicured nails tapping absently against the surface of the table, her expression carefully neutral. They didn't know what was coming. Not yet. Walter cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I called this meeting today because concerns have been raised about certain irregularities within the company." His voice was measured, deliberate. "Concerns that demand our full attention." A few murmurs rippled through the room, a few exchanged looks, but no one spoke. They were waiting. Grayson leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression one of forced curiosity. "Irregularities?" he repeated. "I wasn't made aware of any issues that warranted a full board meeting." Walter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the large monitor at the front of the room. A moment later, the screen came to life, displaying a series of financial statements. The offshore accounts, the manipulated payrolls, the stolen funds. The air in the room changed in an instant. Brooks stiffened. Grayson's eyes narrowed. The other executives shifted in their seats, their silence louder than any protest. "This," Walter continued, his voice steady, "is the result of an internal investigation into our financial operations. What you're seeing here are unauthorized transactions, money that should have been allocated to employee wages, retirement funds, performance bonuses." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Money that never made it to its intended recipients. Brooks recovered first. "These figures are misleading," she said smoothly. "Without proper context, they could be interpreted incorrectly." Amalia stepped forward then, for the first time making her presence known. "Then let's provide context." Every head in the room turned toward her. The room, already heavy with tension, went silent. She could see it happening. The flicker of recognition, the slow realization. The shift in the air as the janitor they had ignored for 2 weeks became someone else entirely. Grayson's eyes darkened. Brooks's mouth pressed into a thin line. She walked calmly to the front of the room, her every movement deliberate. She could feel the weight of their stares, but she didn't let it shake her. She was done being invisible. "I've spent the last 2 weeks working in this building," she said, her voice carrying through the room, "not as an executive, not as Walter Carter's daughter, but as a janitor." She let the words sink in, let them feel the full impact of what she had just revealed. "I cleaned these offices. I listened to conversations I wasn't meant to hear. And I saw, firsthand, how this company treats the people who keep it running." A murmur of unease swept through the room. She could see some of them shifting in discomfort, realizing what this meant. "I didn't just see the financial discrepancies," she continued. "I saw the culture that allowed them to exist. I saw how management turned a blind eye to abuse. I saw how people like Thomas Grayson and Cynthia Brooks used their positions to exploit others, to manipulate, to steal." Grayson finally spoke, his voice low, dangerous. "You expect us to believe this?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I don't expect you to believe anything," she said. "I have proof." She turned back to the screen. The next slide appeared, a compilation of audio recordings, time-stamped and verified. Conversations detailing the embezzlement, the discussions about taking over the company, the laughter at the expense of the workers who would never see the money they had rightfully earned. Then came the videos. Footage captured from discreetly placed cameras. Grayson knocking over her cleaning cart. Brooks tossing trash onto the floor just to watch her pick it up. The sheer, deliberate cruelty. The reaction in the room was immediate. Gasps, whispers, glances exchanged between board members who had never seen this side of their executives before. Walter stood then, his face unreadable. "I built this company on integrity," he said quietly, "on the belief that every employee deserves respect no matter their position." He looked at Grayson. "And you?" He let the question hang. "You built your career here by tearing others down." Grayson's jaw clenched. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Brooks, beside him, remained silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Walter turned his attention to the board, Effective immediately, Thomas Grayson and Cynthia Brooks are to be removed from their positions. Legal action will be pursued where necessary. He paused, glancing at Amalia. And as of today, my daughter will be assuming a new role within Carter Tech. The silence was absolute. Amalia looked around the room, meeting the gazes of every executive who had once overlooked her, who had dismissed her as nothing more than a nameless worker. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was in control. The fallout began immediately. The boardroom had barely emptied before the ripples of what had happened began spreading through Carter Tech like a tremor signaling the start of an earthquake. Word traveled fast in corporate environments, and even faster when it involved the dramatic downfall of two of the company's most powerful executives. Employees whispered in the hallways. Phones buzzed with messages passing between departments. By midday, the news had reached even the most junior workers. Thomas Grayson and Cynthia Brooks were gone. Security had escorted them from the building within the hour. Grayson had left in silence, his carefully composed mask cracking only slightly as the reality of his defeat settled in. Brooks had been less composed, murmuring half-hearted threats about legal action, about the misunderstandings that had led to this decision, though no one seemed to take her words seriously. Amalia watched it all unfold with a sense of finality, but not relief. There was no pleasure in seeing them removed, no satisfaction in their downfall. There was only the quiet certainty that it had to happen. The company couldn't continue under their leadership, not with what she had seen, not with what she now knew. She had expected chaos in the wake of the revelation, but what followed was something else entirely. A strange, tense silence settled over the company. The executive floors felt different, lighter in some ways, yet heavier in others. People walked with more caution, as if uncertain whether they should celebrate or brace for whatever came next. There was no celebration. Not yet. Walter Carter remained in his office for most of the day, taking calls, speaking with legal advisors, ensuring that every step of the process was handled correctly. He was deliberate, methodical, but Amalia could see the exhaustion in his posture, the weight of years of trust being shattered. She met him in the late afternoon, standing in the doorway of his office as he reviewed another stack of documents. He looked up when he saw her, the tired lines around his eyes deepening. "You did what needed to be done," he said simply. She nodded, stepping inside. "And now we need to make sure it doesn't happen again." He leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "That's the part no one talks about. It's easy to remove people. It's harder to change the culture they left behind." She knew he was right. Removing Grayson and Brooks was only the first step. The real work was just beginning. She spent the next few days moving through the company as herself for the first time since the experiment had begun. No longer in uniform, no longer hiding behind an assumed identity, she walked the same halls she had cleaned, sat in meetings with the same people who had ignored her presence just a week ago, and she saw the changes immediately. Some people avoided her, some wouldn't meet her eyes. Others were overly polite, as if unsure how to navigate the shift in dynamic. The janitorial staff, the workers who had been her colleagues in silence, regarded her with something else entirely: curiosity, wariness, maybe even a trace of respect. She had been one of them, even if only for a short time. They had seen her scrub the same floors, empty the same trash bins, and they had watched her endure the same treatment they had endured for years. She stopped by the janitorial office, the small windowless room where she had once received her assignments. The same supervisor who had handed her the keys on her first day was there, flipping through paperwork, barely looking up as she stepped inside. "You're back," he said, his voice neutral. "I was never really gone," she replied. He finally looked at her then, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "And now what?" "Now," she said, "things change." She didn't expect immediate trust, not from the people who had spent years believing that change was impossible. But she had seen too much to walk away from it now. Her first move was internal restructuring. Departments that had operated unchecked were placed under review. Financial oversight was strengthened, ensuring that no money could disappear without accountability. A new compliance team was introduced, one that reported directly to her, bypassing the usual corporate red tape that had allowed corruption to flourish for so long. But policy changes weren't enough. The culture had to shift, and that meant addressing the unspoken hierarchy that had allowed abuse to thrive. She started with the employees at the bottom. One by one, she met with workers from every level of the company, not in formal boardrooms, but in their own spaces. She sat in the break rooms, listening as employees hesitated before speaking, as they tested whether their voices would actually be heard this time. She heard their frustrations, their exhaustion, their quiet anger at years of being overlooked. And she made it clear that things would be different. It wasn't about promises, it was about action. She implemented new policies that protected low-level employees from retaliation. She created anonymous reporting systems that couldn't be tampered with by management. She increased wages where it was possible, ensuring that the people who kept Carter Tech running were compensated fairly. It was slow. It was difficult. Not everyone was happy about it. There were executives who resisted the changes, who believed that things had functioned just fine before and saw no reason to upend the existing structure. But she didn't back down. She had spent too much time in the shadows of this company to allow it to slip back into the same patterns. She saw the change in small ways first. Employees who once walked with their heads down began to look up. Conversations in the hallways shifted. The fear that had once permeated the lower levels of the company began to lessen, if only slightly. One evening, as she walked through the now familiar corridors, she passed a janitor she recognized from her time in disguise. An older man, quiet, the kind who had spent years blending into the background. He hesitated as she approached, then gave her the smallest nod. It wasn't much, but it was something. She knew there was still work to do. There would always be work to do. But for the first time, Carter Tech felt like a place worth saving. And, for the first time, Amalia Carter knew exactly what kind of leader she was meant to be. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Check out other videos for more engaging content, and don't forget to share this video with others who might find it interesting.